You may be seated. It really is good to be here and good to see all of you here today. And as I talked to you just a few minutes ago, I explained to you that today we're going to talk about immigration. God has a heart for immigrants, and God wants us to have a heart for immigrants. But there's a balance that's laid out in Scripture that we need to see about this whole subject of immigration. And I got to tell you this, in our political climate today, the liberals are way over here on one side, and the conservatives are way over here on the other side, and never the twain shall meet. At least that's the way it looks. But as is the case most of the time, the truth about any issue is somewhere between the two extremes. Did you ever notice that? That's where the truth usually lies, and that's what I see as I looked at the Scriptures regarding this whole issue of immigration. We're going to start today in Leviticus chapter 19, verses 33 and 34. And you know, in a lot of churches, this whole immigration issue might not be that big a deal, but it is at the Open Door Church. Do you know why it is? We have immigrants here. We have people who are not native-born Americans that are here, and they're part of our church. A Hispanic congregation meets at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and it is vitally important that those of us who are natural-born U.S. citizens have a good understanding of what God says about immigrants. I mean, we got Jose and Josue with us today here in our English service. Let's let them know how glad we are they're here. They come every Sunday. I'm telling you. So let's look at God's perspective on immigration. Leviticus 19, 33 and 34. It says, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. Now, did he stutter when he said that? When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. For the foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Get that? Do you know what he was really telling them? If you're going to let them live there, treat them like you would treat a citizen. Isn't that what that says? If you're going to let them live there, treat them just like you would treat a citizen. Here's the introduction. Some of the earliest scenes from the Bible are stories about immigrants. Did you know that? People who migrated from one place to another, left their country and went to another country. The father of Abraham was a man named Terah, who left his homeland, Ur of the Chaldeans, and migrated to the land of Canaan. In short, Terah and his adult son and daughter-in-law, Abraham and Sarah, along with his grandson Lot, were immigrants. That's how Moses described them when he wrote this in Genesis 11, verse 31. He wrote, Terah took his son Abraham and his grandson Lot, son of Harran, and his daughter-in-law Sarah, the wife of his son Abraham, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. Now, when they left home and traveled to a foreign country to settle there, what were they? Immigrants. Did you ever stop to think that Abraham and Sarah, the one that we've heard Bible stories about from the time we were children, were immigrants? But that's exactly what they were. You see, they didn't travel to their intended migrant destination. They didn't make it all the way to the land of Canaan on the first leg of their journey. Instead, Genesis 11:31 says, when they came to Harran, that's a village that Terah named after his deceased son, who was Lot's father, and he died before they ever left Ur of the Chaldees. It says they settled there. They didn't make it all the way to Canaan, but they made it part of the way, and then they settled there. And so Abraham and Sarah lived in Haran until after the death of Abraham's father, Terah. And then they migrated on to the land of Canaan, which was their original destination. This is what Moses wrote, Genesis 12:1, and then down in verses 4 and 5. He wrote, the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country and your people and your father's household to the land I will show you. So Abraham went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, all of the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Now I want to give you something. I want to give you something from God's perspective here about immigrants. I don't know how long it takes, but I do know this. When Abraham and Sarah, as young people, with Abraham's father and Abraham's nephew Lot, when they left Ur of the Chaldeans and they traveled part of the way to their destination of Canaan, but wound up settling in Harran, after a while, and I don't know how long a while it was, but after a while, when God looked at them, he looked at the land of Haran as their homeland. And he looked at the people there as their people. Did you see that in the verses we just read? Because look at what he said. He says to Abraham, now they've been living in Haran for a while. We don't know exactly how long, but the Lord had said to Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to a land I will show you. So they went, as the Lord had told him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from where? Haran. God wasn't talking about something he told him from Ur of the Chaldeans. He was talking about something he told him from Haran, and he referred to Haran as your homeland and your people. So this is what I got to tell you. When we let people, foreigners, live here for a certain amount of time, as far as God's concerned, this is their homeland, and we are their people. Do you understand that? I mean, I'm just taking that right from the book. I'm trying to show you God's heart about immigration. Let's go ahead. Abraham and Sarah have now, for the second time in their lives, been immigrants because they've now left Haran and gone to the land of Canaan. And due to what we might call a natural disaster, Abraham and Sarah and Lot became immigrants for a third time. Moses wrote about this in Genesis chapter 12, verse number 10. He wrote, now there was a famine in the land, that's in the land of Canaan, where they have settled after their second migration. And Abraham went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. So what's he done now? He's left Canaan and he's gone to Egypt, another foreign country. He's an immigrant for the third time. Now I want to talk to you about the first immigration law. You get this? We argue about whether there ought to be immigration laws. There's some people on the extreme liberal end of the political spectrum today that think we ought to have just totally open borders, a borderless globe. Right here in the book of Genesis chapter 12, which is early in human history, there were immigration laws. Do you know what you have to have if you have immigration laws? Do you know what that presupposes? Borders. You get that? Where a group of people says, this is our country, and they draw the line. And they say, borders. You couldn't have a map if you didn't have borders, could you? Borders. You got to have borders in order to have immigration law, because immigration law says, this is our line, this is our border, and you don't come across our border. That's what an immigration law is, isn't it? Or at least it sets requirements for coming across there. Let me read you about the first immigration law. Because he was evidently a fearful man, Abraham concocted this scheme that backfired on him and caused Pharaoh of Egypt to pass this first immigration law that I can find in the Bible. Moses wrote about it. It's in Genesis 12, verses 11 to 15. As he was about to enter Egypt, now this is Abraham, the famine has come in Canaan, and they're about to migrate to Egypt, and they've gotten down to the border of Egypt. How could you know when you entered Egypt if there wasn't a border? You get that? So as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife, Sarah, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me. Implication is to get you. They will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. What's he saying? Don't tell him you're my wife. Tell him you're my sister. Now, she was his half-sister. She really was. I mean, if you go back and read the genealogy, she really was his half-sister, but she was his wife. And he's saying, don't tell him you're my wife, just tell him you're my sister. because he was afraid that the Egyptians would see how pretty she was, and they would kill him to get her, take her to be their wife, their concubine, put in their harem. You get the idea? He's not all that concerned about what happens to Sarah, is he? He's concerned about Abraham. That's a real smudge on him, don't you think? But look what happens here. So when Abraham came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw her, that Sarah was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. Do you know what that means? He took her to become his wife. He took her and put her in his harem. And I won't go any further than that, but just use your imagination. Whether he actually did it or not, his intention was for her to be his wife. So the scheme then begins to unravel, because God judged the host country, in this case Egypt, for the way they were treating Sarai, an Israeli immigrant. Look at what Moses wrote in verses 17 to 19. The Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abraham. What have you done to me, he said. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her to be my wife? And the implication is now God has brought these terrible diseases on me and my people because of what you have done. You see, God is holding the host nation responsible, and he's judging the host nation because of the way they're treating the immigrants. You see, the Egyptians let the immigrants come in. They let Abraham and Sarah cross the border and come in. They let them live there. They had kind of an open immigration policy at that point. And listen, if you have an open immigration policy and you're going to let people come in, you're not going to enforce any laws, then what does this indicate? God holds you responsible for the way you treat them while they're here. Because they are human beings created in the image of God. You need to get that. At that point, Pharaoh passed the first immigration law. Wouldn't you if you were in his place? He passed the first immigration law. Pharaoh said, this is in Genesis 12:19, now then, here is your wife, take her and go. Was that an immigration law? The first immigration law was a deportation order. Take her and go. What was he saying? Get out of my country. I don't want you here anymore. That's what he said. He gave orders to the men serving under his authority to enforce his new immigration law. Moses wrote this, Genesis 12, verse number 20. Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abraham and to his men, and they went and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. So the first immigration law was a deportation order. We want them out. You get that? And you know what we find as we go ahead and read in the rest of that chapter? God did not criticize or judge the Egyptians for sending them away, for deporting them, for having an immigration law that says we don't want you here. But as long as they didn't have a law and weren't enforcing a law that said we don't want you here, and you let them be there, then you're expected to treat them well. In fact, he said treat them just like the native born. You get that? Too bad we didn't know that 20 years ago. You know, we might not have the problem we have today if we had applied this 20 years ago. Now, from this biblical account, we can conclude that it is appropriate for the leader of a nation to enforce immigration laws by deporting immigrants who are deemed a security risk to the host nation. Do you think that Pharaoh thought that Abraham and Sarah were a security risk to his country? I mean, the whole country's been inflicted with these horrible diseases because of them and because of the way they've been treated, even though they didn't know that they were immigrants, that they were married. The Egyptians didn't know that because Abraham lied about it. But God still held that nation responsible for how they were treating them. Do you think Pharaoh thought that Abraham and Sarah were a security risk? I think so. And because they were a security risk, he sent them away. And God didn't criticize Pharaoh for doing that. He criticized him for the way he treated them if he let them stay there, but he didn't criticize him for sending them away. Do you get the application? If we're going to let immigrants come in, if we're going to have such a lax enforcement of our immigration policies that we let them come in, we need to treat them just like we would treat citizens. That's what this is saying. But if we deem them to be a security risk, then what? If they become a danger to our nation, if they become a threat to our nation, then what? Then it's legitimate to deport them. Isn't that what this says? That's exactly what Pharaoh of Egypt did. And I can't find anywhere where God criticized him for that. So let's look at another section. Let's look at more immigration. That's just the first story. Let's look at some more immigration. Abraham's grandson Jacob, whose name God changed to Israel, he also became a migrant. He was an immigrant. And it happened as a result of a severe famine that struck the land of Canaan. You see, when Abraham had to leave Egypt, he went back to Canaan. A couple of generations later, during his grandson's days, another famine came to the land of Canaan. Moses described Jacob's or Israel's immigration from Canaan down to Egypt. He did just what his grandpa did. He said, things are tough here, we'll go to Egypt. And this is what he wrote. This is in Genesis chapter 46, verses 6 and 7. So Jacob and all his offspring went to Egypt, taking with them their livestock and the possessions they had acquired in Canaan. Jacob brought with him to Egypt his sons and his grandsons and his daughters and his granddaughters, all of his offspring. You remember the story, right? The story where it started out God preparing them for this migration. The famine had come and they ran out of food, and he sent his sons down to Egypt to buy food, and they didn't know it, but the man who was the prime minister of Egypt in charge of the whole food supply was Joseph, their little brother that they had sold into slavery years before. And they get down there, and Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. And Joseph gives them food and sends them back home, but says you can't come back and get any more food unless you bring your little brother with you, because that was his own brother, his full brother Benjamin, that he hadn't seen in years, and he wanted to see him. Inquired if their father was still alive, sent him back home. Then they run out of food again. They're forced to go back and take Benjamin with them. Joseph reveals himself to them, sends them back home, says, bring your father because you're all going to perish. There's going to be 7 more years of this famine. So bring your father here. You can live in the land of Egypt. And they migrate to Egypt. So Jacob and his descendants, Israel and his descendants, they migrate down to Egypt. And the descendants of Jacob remained in Egypt for more than 430 years. Until a severe case of xenophobia. You know what xenophobia is? If you listen to the news much, have you heard that word? They talk about that word, xenophobia. You know what that means? This comes from 2 Greek words. One of them means fear, that's phobia, and the other one is xenos, and that's a foreigner in Hebrew. Fear of the foreigners swept across Egypt. And here's how we know that happened. Moses wrote about it. Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, and then down to verse 11. He wrote, a new king came to power in Egypt. This is a king that didn't know how the Israelis got there, didn't know anything about how Joseph had saved the nation through his food policies and through his dreams and prophecies and all of that. He didn't know that. So this new king, he came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, they'll join our enemies and fight against us, and they'll leave the country. They're our slaves, and they'll get away. But they're getting to be too many of them. What's happening here? The Egyptians are becoming afraid of the foreigners because the foreigners are having more babies than the Egyptians are, and their population is growing, and it's getting close to the population of the Egyptians, the natural-born people there, and so they're beginning to get afraid. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. They became afraid of them, so they began to oppress them and make them slaves. They weren't treating them very well, were they? Xenophobia, this fear of the foreigner, caused the Egyptian citizens of the host country, to mistreat these Israeli immigrants, and as a result, God judged Egypt with the 10 plagues that left the country in ruins. You remember those stories, right? All the 10 plagues that came. God's judgment on the Egyptians because they were mistreating Israeli immigrants. They let them come. They invited them in. They didn't enforce any immigration laws. And now they think that they're becoming a security risk to the nation rather than deport them like the previous Pharaoh had done and didn't get into any trouble because of it. They want to keep them and make them slaves. They want to mistreat them. And God sends 10 judgments on them in the form of 10 plagues. Let's look and see what happens after the 10th plague. When it got so bad, anybody remember the 10th plague? God killed the firstborn son and the firstborn of all of the animals in the entire land of Egypt except the Israelis. Do you think that upset the company, or upset the country? You think that kind of upset the status quo of the Egyptian nation? When they woke up the next morning and every firstborn animal and human being was dead. Man, if you'd have been in the funeral business in Egypt at that time, you'd have been well off, wouldn't you? Massive death. And then guess what happened? Pharaoh finally gave the deportation order. He passed another immigration law. And that immigration law was let them go. Get rid of them. Because he views them now as a security threat to his nation. This is what Moses wrote. Exodus 12, beginning with verse 31, going down to some excerpts down to verse 41. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, said, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Take your flocks and herds, as you have said, and go." The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, "We will all die." So in the minds of the Egyptians, have the Israeli immigrants become a security problem? I think so. We're all going to die. The length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt, and thus began the Israeli migration from Egypt back to the land of Canaan. Do you see how immigrants have been all through the scriptures? And God has some principles here about how a nation is supposed to relate to immigrants. If you welcome them in, if you don't enforce an immigration law to prevent them from coming in, then you're supposed to treat them well when they're there. If they're a security risk, you can either not let them come in or you can deport them. It's totally up to the host nation. But you can't let them stay and mistreat them. That's pretty simple. Let's look at God's perspective on this whole matter a little further. As the Israeli immigrants were returning to Canaan from Egypt, they stopped for a layover at the foot of Mount Sinai where they received God's law. Do you remember that? They've miraculously crossed the Red Sea, or the Red Sea. God parted the waters, and it stood up like a wall on each side, and they marched through. And shortly after they crossed the sea out there in the desert, they came to Mount Sinai, and it was there where God gave them his law. And inserted into the law was a rather startling statement about immigrants, because these people had been immigrants. Now they're going back home to what was their homeland, back to the land of Canaan, They're going back home again, and God's going to put them in that land and keep them there for generations, and he wants to be sure they understand how they're supposed to treat immigrants. They have been immigrants. They know what it's like to be on the other side of the fence. They know what it's like to be mistreated. And so now, when they get back into the land of Canaan, God wants to make sure they understand what they're supposed to do about these immigrants. It's in Leviticus 19, verses 33 and 34. It's where we started. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. If you're going to let them live there, don't mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Now, did you get that? God said, when a foreigner resides among you, do not mistreat them. In fact, God said, the foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. In other words, when a host country allows productive, law-abiding immigrants to live within their borders, they don't view them as a security threat, then those immigrants are to be treated just like the citizens of that nation are treated. Now, when judging nations, and does God judge nations? We just saw him judge Egypt twice, didn't we? In these verses that we've read. When judging nations, Jesus takes into consideration whether or not those nations have welcomed immigrants and then treated them right after you welcomed them. God takes that in, when God gets ready to judge a nation, he takes that into consideration. Here's how we know that. Matthew chapter 25, we'll read some excerpts from verse 31 down to verse number 36. Look at what he said. He said, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him. He's about to judge not individuals, but what? Nations. All the nations will be gathered before him. And then the king will say, come, you blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. Now look at the basis of his judgment to say to some of these nations, you're blessed by my Father, and you get this wonderful inheritance. You get to come into this kingdom prepared by my Father. And by the way, that's the 1,000-year kingdom of Jesus here on planet Earth at the end of the church age, and we don't have time to get into all that, but that's the kingdom he's talking about. But here's the basis of his judging these nations. He said, for I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. Now here's the one I really want you to get. I was a stranger. You know what the Greek word there is? A foreigner. I was a foreigner, and look, you invited me in. What does that mean? I was a foreigner and you invited me in. Isn't that talking about welcoming immigrants? You see, God has a heart for nations who welcome immigrants. Now, we're going to see as we go further here that we should welcome immigrants, but if there are immigrants that are a known security threat to us, we're not required to welcome them. And if they get in, we're not required to let them stay in, because Pharaoh gave the order to Abraham to do what? Take your wife and go. After the 10 plagues came on Egypt, or later Pharaoh did what? He's commanded them. Get all your livestock, get all your people, and go. It was a deportation order. There was immigration law. And God never criticized that. We welcome immigrants. But if they become a threat to our national security, we either don't let them in or we deport them. Now, can we take that and transport that over thousands of years of time and set it down right in America in the last 2 years? President Trump, whether you like him or not, doesn't matter. President Trump gave an executive order for an immigration ban, right? Listing, I think, about 11 nations that were majority Muslim nations, nations known to sponsor terrorism, nations known to want to wipe out the Western world and the nation of Israel, and have participated in the training of terrorists and shipping terrorism out to the Western world. And he said, we got to stop that. These terrorists are coming in, and they're killing people, and they're blowing up buildings, and they're doing this, and they're doing that. We got to stop this. You know, it was some of those terrorists that were welcomed in an open policy back on 9/11 that flew 2 airliners into the World Trade Centers and blew them up and killed 6,000 innocent people. And President Trump said, we have got to stop that. We've got to limit immigration from those countries. And people went nuts. Remember that? What does this say? Was that an appropriate thing to do based on what we just read here? Absolutely. And I don't care whether it was Donald Trump or Barack Obama or Bill Clinton or George W. Bush. I don't care what president from what party it was. That is legitimate. To refuse to allow people to come into your country who are a security risk. That's legitimate. That's what we find here. But that doesn't mean you shut down all immigration. Because one of the ways that your nation is blessed when God gets ready to judge your nation is when you took in foreigners. I was a foreigner, he said, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. So it is in the best interest of any nation to welcome productive, law-abiding immigrants. God's pleased with nations who do so. However, it is in the best interest of any nation to deport immigrants who have proven themselves to be a security risk to the nation, as we've already discovered. That's what Pharaoh did to Abraham and Sarah. That's what a later Pharaoh did to all the descendants of Jacob after the 10 plagues and resulted in the Exodus. It is also in the best interest of any nation to refuse entrance into its country any immigrants whose leaders deem them to be a security risk. That's what the king of Edom did to the Israeli immigrants when they were returning from Egypt to Canaan. You know, they've been down to Canaan, the 10 plagues. Now they're having to migrate back, down to Egypt, and now they're migrating back to Canaan. This is what Moses wrote. They ran into a little incident. And you know, this stuff, all these stories in the Old Testament, is that just late night entertainment? Is that what that's in there for? It's to teach us lessons. God didn't put anything in here by accident. Here's the story that he put in during their migration back to Canaan. Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom, saying, we are here at Kadesh, a town on the edge of your territory. So what did Moses know? The Edomites had a border that defined their territory, their nation. And he said, we're on the edge of your territory. And what did Moses also know? These people have some immigration law. We can't just cross their border. Because look what happens. Why else would he send messengers to say, we're here on the edge of your territory? Then look at what he says. Please let us pass through your country. What's he doing? He's asking permission to come in and pass through. Isn't that what he's doing? What would that imply? That the host country has the legal right, the legal privilege to say either yes or no. You can come in or you can't come in. And so he asks permission. But the Edom answered, you may not pass through here. If you try, we will march out and attack you with a sword. What was he saying? We're going to send our military out and we are going to protect our border. Isn't that what he said? Can we bring that across a couple thousand years of time? Do this again? Mass immigration from south of the border? Drug lords? Criminals? Muslims who have gone to South America and are migrating northward? Extreme radicalized Muslims to get in here and try to destroy America? Coming across that border? And President Trump gets in office and he says, well, this has got to stop. And he sends the National Guard down to secure the border. And what happened? People went nuts. Isn't that exactly what the king of Edom did? And you go ahead and read that story and guess what you find out? God never criticized the king of Edom for doing that. And these were God's own people that he didn't want in. You get that? So yeah, a country can legitimately have immigration laws and not let people come in that you deem to be a security threat. Whether you're right or not doesn't matter. If that's what you deem, if that's what you think, then you can keep them from coming. And since Edom refused to let them go through their territory, Israel turned away from them. You know what that means? The Israelis under Moses' leadership evidently understood the legitimacy of Edom's immigration policy. Don't cross our border, don't come in here. And so they went around Edom on their way back to Canaan. You get that? There it is in Scripture. Here's the conclusion. Here's the conclusion. The Bible is not a policy book on immigration. Get that? It is not. But it does reveal to us God's will for immigrants in their host nations. For example, God doesn't want immigrants to be mistreated. That's a basic principle. He also wants them to have the same responsibilities and benefits as citizens. That's what Moses said. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Get that? If you're going to let them live here, treat them just like somebody who was born here. What does that mean? You get the same responsibilities. You get the same benefits. Get that? Same responsibilities. This scripture seems to indicate that U.S. immigration reform should include maybe a legal pathway to citizenship for the 11.3 million undocumented immigrants who are currently here. Moses put it like this: they are residing among you. So what are we supposed to do? Treat them just like the native born. Treat them just like citizens. If they are productive, law-abiding immigrants and there's no security risk, then we're supposed to treat them just like citizens. By the way, we don't get this from the liberal media. You have to do a little research to get this. Only half of these 11.3 million immigrants, approximately 5.5 million of them, are Mexican immigrants. But if you ask the person on the street, you know what they'll say? They think that almost all the immigrants are Mexicans. Less than half, slightly less than half, are actually Mexican immigrants. And they should be treated as the native born, which means required to fulfill the responsibilities of citizenship. That means that they ought to pay local and state and federal income taxes, right? If they want the benefit of being a citizen, if they want to be able to cash in on all of the benefits, then what do they ought to do? Help pay for it. Isn't that treating them like a citizen? They ought to pay the local, the state, and the federal income taxes. They ought to pay Social Security and Medicare. They ought to get a driver's license. Isn't that true? Don't you have to get a driver's license? They ought to get a driver's license. They ought to pay a reasonable fine for breaking U.S. immigration law to gain entrance into the country to begin with. Just like any other American citizen would be penalized for breaking a federal law. You get that? If they're going to be treated just like our native born, what happens to you if you break a federal law? You're going to be arrested and there's going to be a penalty, right? They broke a federal law, many of them, not all of them, but many, the undocumented ones, they broke a federal law to get here. They came in illegally, they broke the law. So what do? There should be a penalty for breaking the law. That penalty doesn't necessarily mean to deport them if they're not a security threat, but it does mean there ought to be a penalty. If you break the law, how many of you have learned that from experience? When you break the law, there's a penalty. Yeah. So shouldn't they be treated just like you're treated? That's what this book says. You get that? So I'm not, this is not hate speech about immigrants. This is just what the book says. And then, once they have required and done whatever is required for them to become citizens, and they're a productive, responsible citizen, fulfilling the responsibilities of citizenship, then they should be given the benefits of citizenship. Who should get the benefits of citizenship? Citizens. Isn't it true? Citizens. Don't get me started on that. So here's the deal. God will bless nations who welcome productive, law-abiding immigrants. Jesus said, "Come, you who are blessed of my Father, and take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, I was a foreigner, I was an immigrant, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. So yeah, we ought to welcome law-abiding, productive, non-security risk immigrants. However, it is in the best interest of nations to refuse entrance and or deport immigrants who have demonstrated themselves to be a security risk to the host nation. If they're a problem, what do? What's the biblical example? You deport them. If they've demonstrated that they were a problem before they ever got here, what do? Don't let them in. It's immigration law. Pharaoh deported Abraham and Sarah and Lot. And later Pharaoh deported all of Jacob's descendants, causing the Exodus. The king of Edom refused to allow the Israeli immigrants to enter his country. In all three of these incidents, the leaders of the nation deemed the immigrants to be a security risk. That's pretty simple, and it's right there in the book. It amazes me why some of our leaders in Washington, D.C., who are the conservative, Bible-believing people, don't just look at what the book says. It's right there in the book. We need to just pull the principles out and apply them accordingly.